Okay, welcome to the lecture for Research Methods, looking at the APA manual. We're talking about the second third of the third chapter of the APA manual, pages 70 to 76. And this part of the manual addresses reducing the use of biased language. So first we'll start off talking about some general guidelines for reducing bias. And notice I do say here in the manual it says reducing bias, not eliminating bias. Not because we're not motivated to do so, but because it's probably unrealistic to eliminate all bias. Because we're generally not always aware of the presence of bias, our own biases. It's hard to see them. So that's why we're going to talk about some guidelines to kind of help increase your awareness of biases that may be present. The first one, which is probably the biggest one in terms of guidelines helping you think about how to write appropriately, is to describe at the appropriate level of specificity. Using an overly broad term implies, or at least creates room for the inference, that all members who that term applies to are the same, and there aren't meaningful differences within that group or people who have that same label, which is biased and kind of negative cultural effects. It also, just in terms of other APA style things, is kind of ambiguous writing. It isn't clear and precise. So describing things with the appropriate level of specificity reduces bias, and it also serves to decrease ambiguity. So I'll give you some examples here. So frequently used things like man and mankind. It's preferred to refer to men and women if you are in fact talking about both men and women. Using men to refer to both men and women is not specific enough. It's too vague. It implies that there's not a meaningful difference between men and women. Same thing for mankind. And we'll talk more about gender in particular in a little bit. Older adults, again, implies that they're all kind of the same. And it's not, you need to specify whatever age range you're talking about. It could be adults ages 65 to 83, ages 65 to 75. Whatever you're talking about, be specific about that, because there are important differences among individuals of different age groups. They aren't all the same. Another one would be homosexuals, refer to all people who have a sexual orientation other than heterosexual. Again, kind of lots of things wrong with that. One being that implies there's no difference between men and women who have a sexual orientation that's not heterosexual. So preferred terms would be gay men or lesbians. And we'll talk more about sexual orientation also in just a little bit. So you want to be appropriately specific, and generally this means not using vague terms, being more specific. However, we don't want to get down into the weeds of details unnecessarily. So you don't have to talk about every difference at every kind of very detailed level. You really only talk about differences when they are relevant. So you wouldn't say, talking about participants, one group was comprised of left-handed colorblind male participants who lived in East Bell County, engaged in exclusively heterosexual romantic interactions. Unless it's important that they're left-handed and colorblind and that they're heterosexual and living in Bell County, you probably wouldn't talk about all that stuff. It'd be, there were 30 male participants. So an appropriate level of specificity is somewhere between too specific and too vague. But generally you're going to be safer if you err on the side of being more specific than if you err on the side of being too vague. Okay, so describing the appropriate level of specificity. The second guideline, be sensitive to labels. And this means a lot of things. Well, how do you know what would be an insensitive label to use? Well, you can try to figure out what the preferred labels are by asking people. So if you have participants, you could ask them to identify. If you're studying something related to ethnicity or sexual orientation, ask them how they identify that. So leave it open-ended rather than using closed-ended report only. It's important to remember that people within a group may disagree about labels, and that labels change over time. So like within, if you're talking about gay men, there's some gay men that would prefer not to use the term gay because they associate it with kind of a history of oppression and kind of negative connotations. and there are others who associate it with kind of an activist movement, and we don't want to be identified with that. But then there are others that feel that very appropriately describes them. So just because you ask one person, oh, if you kind of fit in my mind that you're in this group, you like this label, everybody else who in your mind fits in that group may not also prefer that label. So be sensitive to that those differences are possible. Another thing to keep in mind, the labels are adjectives, not nouns. So use them as adjectives, not as nouns. So you wouldn't say the Latinos, but you say the Latino participants or the Latino lawyers. Whatever you're talking about, that label is an adjective. It's not who they are. It's part of their identity. Um, you want to avoid using pejorative labels. So talking about a group of individuals with dementia of the Alzheimer's type, you wouldn't talk about them as the demented group. It's kind of has too much of a negative connotation. You need to find another way to say that. Another thing that kind of cuts across a lot of categories, and we'll talk more about when we come back to talking persons with disabilities, is using person-first language. So we don't talk about, in our field, schizophrenics or depressives. They're individuals with schizophrenia or clients diagnosed with depression. So the person comes before the label. The label doesn't become what the person is. And it's also not schizophrenic patients. So put the person literally first in the sentence. The third general guideline is acknowledge participation. This talks about how we refer to participants. We won't talk as much about this one as the other two. The other two probably need to pay more attention to. But just some things to note here. You can refer to people in your study as subjects or participants. For a while, APA didn't want to use the word subject because it was thought to be demeaning. But in the latest manual, they said, oh, yeah, actually, we've used that word for years, and it's not any more or less demeaning than participant. So you can use either one. And when talking about your participants, as much as possible, use active language to acknowledge their participation. Don't think of your participants and don't write about your participants as objects that you do stuff to. But write about them as people that do things. So focus on what they did or will do more than what was done or will be done to them. So again, use active language whenever possible. Okay, so now let's look at some instances, in more particular beyond these guidelines, where these things come up. The first one we'll talk about is writing about gender. So the first thing I want you to do is, imagine in your mind's eye, for just a moment, a caveman. So you kind of think about the clothes and the caveman is holding. You got an image? Okay, if you're like the typical person, most of you probably imagine something like this. Thereabouts. And nothing wrong with that, but why don't half the people imagine something like this? Why do most people, when asked to picture a caveman, picture a man? And some say, well, because you said caveman and man is man. That's very observant. But for a long time, caveman was used as a gender-neutral term and thought to represent all peoples of a certain era, just like a fireman or policeman. But we know from research on adults and especially with children looking at how they learn language that there really is no such thing as a gender-neutral he. If you use a gender-neutral he, it's not gender-neutral. People will associate it with men. Traditionally, masculine pronouns and nouns have been used to refer to all people. And using these terms, again, is ambiguous. If you're talking about men and women, it's not clear that it's talking about men and women, or it's talking just about men. It's ambiguous, and there's also kind of a subtext there that the typical person is a male and not a female. Why isn't there a gender-neutral she? It has to do with stuff we won't get into in terms of politics and culture. But we don't use gender-biased language APA style, so kind of try to separate yourself from the idea of that gender-neutral he and recognize that beyond the he, also those words like fireman, policeman, mailman. Instead, use gender-neutral terms. So firefighter, police officer, mail carrier. And again, there's no kind of, it's not overly burdensome to do that. It just takes paying attention to what you're saying. So since there's no gender-neutral he, we want to avoid using the pronoun he to refer to both men and women. So one thing you'll see frequently is the use of he or she in the place of that he pronoun, or she or he. The order doesn't really matter. So you might see a sentence with that, but you don't want to write it he/she or she/he. That would be inconsistent with the APA style. So if you're going to do the he or she, make sure you write it out with the or. And sometimes that can feel a bit burdensome if you're having to do it a lot. Kind of as you're reading through your paper, it may not feel like it flows very well. Once or twice it doesn't really get in the way, but repeatedly it may get in the way. So one way around that. We'll look here. If we said, okay, if a participant, yada yada, was asked to do something, then he or she may opt to choose something else. Because it's not that bad, but if we're doing it multiple times, it might be burdensome. One way to get around that is just to change the subject of the sentence to a plural from singular. So instead of if a participant, change to if participants, blah blah blah, then they may opt to blah blah blah. And now the they, that plural pronoun, really is gender neutral. It's not clearly male or female, and you will have indicated earlier who your participants are if they're men or women. And there are other ways around it, but that's probably one of the easier workarounds in terms of that he or she if it becomes too burdensome. Kind of one more note on that topic. Don't use guys and girls. For one thing, it's kind of colloquial, which again is APA style, as you know. But it's also not in kind of a parallel form. Guys kind of implies could refer to grown males. Right? Girls is more diminutive, refers to younger women. So if we're talking about adults, we call them guys and girls. Now we're calling the male participants an adult term, and the female participants more of a younger term, which would be biased language. So you want to avoid doing that. Okay, so let's talk about gender and sex and what they mean. Well, authors sometimes disagree about the exact meaning of these terms, about what is gender and what is sex and how should we use it. But in general, use gender to refer to a culturally defined role, and use sex to refer to the biological sex of an individual. And when you're writing about this, you use kind of male or female, man or woman. Use male or female as an adjective, and use man or woman, boy or girl as a noun. So you might have 20 male participants, you might have 20 Sinhalese women, but you wouldn't have 20 males or 20 females. So male and female, think of those as adjectives, and use man, woman, boy, girl, child, rabbit, bunny, whatever you're talking about as your noun, for clarity's sake. And you may also need to distinguish between biological sex and the verb form of sex. You just do that with the term sexual behavior. If you're talking about participants' sex, that's talking about biological sex. If you're talking about them having sex, talk about the participants' sexual behavior. One more thing about gender and sex. The term opposite sex you're discouraged from using it because it implies a far greater difference than is supported by research. So there are some interesting differences between men and women, but they're by no means opposite. Almost any characteristic you look at, you have these overlapping distributions where the two groups are more similar to each other than they are different, and they're more different within groups than they are between groups. So opposite sex is really a misnomer and misleading. Okay. Last thing about gender, there's frequently confusion about what terms to use when referring to people whose biological sex and or sexual identity or gender is different from what's typically experienced, typically being statistically speaking. So we'll talk about a couple of terms related to that. And none of these terms, it's important to note, are directly related to sexual orientation. So knowing that someone is transgendered or cross-dresser or intersex doesn't tell you anything about who they're attracted to. Those are independent concepts. We'll start off with this first one here. So transgender, some adjective. Transgender refers to someone, like I said, whose gender or sexual identity doesn't conform to these kind of typical gender norms. It includes individuals whose gender identity doesn't match the gender associated with the sexual organs they were born with. And if this is causing them anxiety and distress and dysfunction, it would meet criteria for the DSM diagnosis of gender identity disorder. But if it doesn't cause them distress and dysfunction, then it's not a disorder. They're just transgender, and it's kind of I was born looking like a man, but I feel like a woman, or I was born looking like a woman, but I feel like a man. So it includes those individuals. But the term also now includes people who are kind of agender or third gender, who just don't feel typically that being called masculine or feminine or male or female really applies to them, and not having to necessarily do anything about them, their kind of sexual organs or biology. They just don't identify with those cultural norms. Okay, so transgender is a very broad term. A transsexual is a transgender person who wishes to express himself or herself as a member of the other sex than their sex at birth. And transsexual can be used as, again, an adjective or a noun, so a transsexual person or a transsexual. But transgender is just an adjective. Transsexual, not the same thing as transvestite or crossdresser. And of these two terms, crossdresser is the preferred term. It's again a very broad term. It refers to someone who dresses as the sex other than the sex of their birth, and it for a lot of different reasons, including drag queens, which are typically homosexual men, gay men who cross-dress for performance reasons. It's part of a show. They don't cross-dress necessarily when out in public or with their partners. It's just in those areas. But it may also involve individuals who cross-dress in order to achieve some state of sexual arousal. And if they do that and it causes distress and they can only get aroused by cross-dressing, then that might meet DSM criteria for transvestic fetishism, which typically occurs in heterosexual males. But we don't call these people transvestites anyway, because that's not person-first language. It would be individuals with transvestic fetishism. So again, depending on what you're talking about, use the appropriate term and be specific. And then the last thing under transgender individuals, intersex. Now, people who are intersex aren't necessarily transgender. I just put it here because it kind of goes with the theme of what we're talking about terms people are unfamiliar with. Intersex individuals are a really diverse group, incredibly diverse. And these are people whose biological sex, as determined by either their genotype, their genes, or their sexual organs, doesn't conform to a typical pattern of exclusively male or exclusively female. So they might have ambiguous genitalia. They might have kind of this chromosomal difference where they're XXY or XYY. So not clearly, according kind of to the really dichotomous definition, male or female, but somewhere in between. And again, their gender identity could be a lot of different things. So they're not necessarily transgender, but it kind of goes in that same category. One thing, we don't use the term hermaphrodite to refer to these people anymore, though you may have heard that, kind of an older term, no longer thought to be appropriate when referring to individuals who are part of this group. Okay. Related topic when writing about sexual orientation. Well, first we need to define sexual orientation, and I think the manual does a good job of providing definition. I'll just repeat it here. It's an enduring pattern of attraction, behavior, emotion, identity, and social contacts. Which is important to include all of that, because I think too frequently people think of it as, well, it's about sex. And if people ask you about your sexual orientation, you probably wouldn't say, oh, it's just about who I like to have sex with. You would talk about all this other stuff. And so when we talk about everybody's sexual orientation, we should talk about everything that it encompasses. And be clear that that's what we're talking about. That's the understanding in the literature right now of what sexual orientation is. And sexual orientation is not the same thing as sexual preference. You might write about sexual preference, but if you do, you're not writing about sexual orientation. That's about who you prefer to have sex with. And you may prefer to have sex with people who you aren't attracted to, because there are lots of reasons to have sex. If you're getting paid for sex, and men pay better than women, or women pay better than men, then you may prefer that group to have sex with, but you're not attracted to them. You don't have a kind of a pattern of attraction or emotional attachment to them, but you prefer that because it pays better. So sexual preference is not the same thing as sexual orientation. So generally, we don't use that term unless you are talking about something very, very specific. Sexual orientation is also not the same thing as sexual behavior. And this kind of recognizes that if somebody engages in same-sex sexual behavior, they don't necessarily have a homosexual sexual orientation or bisexual sexual orientation. And if somebody engages in sex with a member of the other sex, don't necessarily have a heterosexual orientation. And again, it's recognizing that the behavior is not the same thing as the orientation, because there's lots of reasons to have sex beyond being attracted to people. And sexual orientation is more than just having sex. It's about being attracted to, who you spend time with, who you are romantically, emotionally attached to. And again, the sex is part of it, but it's not the only thing. So you have to make a distinction there. So when you're talking about sexual behavior, there's a couple things to kind of keep in mind. Some terms you may, if you're writing in this area, may need to be familiar with. You can use terms like same-gender sexual behavior rather than homosexual sexual behavior. And sometimes it's important just to be talking about a large study. You have to be very clear and say, we're talking about male-male sexual behavior, female-male sexual behavior, or male-female. Those are obviously the same thing, just different orders. Or male-female sexual behavior. And using this language recognizes that sometimes it's important to distinguish between the behavior and the orientation, because they are overlapping but distinct concepts. Okay, what terms do we use when talking about sexual orientation? For women who identify as maybe you would think of as having a homosexual orientation, refer to them as lesbians. For men, it's gay men, and for men or women who report a bisexual sexual orientation, it's bisexual men or bisexual women. And then the term gay can be used as an adjective to refer to the group of individuals, both gay men and lesbians, if used as an adjective. But again, typically it's better to be more specific, because there are kind of important differences between lesbians and gay men regarding most of the research we look at. And you may also see kind of some of the alphabet soup when talking about members of these groups who have these sexual orientations. Things like LGBT, LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. And it's depending on what you're writing about, what community you're writing about, that may or may not be appropriate. And then often has to do with being sensitive to the labels that people are comfortable with in using the language that they use. One last thing to note about sexual orientation: we've talked about it's not preference, it's not behavior. So that really should kind of stick in your head that there's really only one way to measure sexual orientation. And it's not asking people who they have sex with, who they prefer to have sex with. It's asking them, what's your sexual orientation? Because it is a part of a person's identity, which is not the same thing as their behavior. Your behavior influences your identity influences your behavior, but they're not the same thing. So that's the one way to measure it, and so keep that in mind when you're writing about sexual orientation. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about writing about racial and ethnic identity. So we'll start by acknowledging that our understanding of race and ethnicity and how best to talk about and write about it continues to evolve. And this means that the terms we use will continue to change, and hopefully so too will our basic understanding of this particular component of our identity. Something that a bit of a moving target, and that's probably a good thing because our past understandings have led to a lot of conflict. So maybe we need some new understandings. So in terms of what terms to use broadly, think about racial identity, ethnic identity versus race. Different authors differ in their use of racial identity or ethnic identity, and sometimes there's a meaningful difference in these two terms. Typically, we think of well, yeah, they are different terms, and one could be broader than the other depending on the context. So you could have two young girls who are African American girls that may have the same racial identity, but they may have different ethnic identities. If one her parents are from Cuba, and the other one, her parents are from Alabama, and their parents are from Alabama, and their parents are from Alabama. They may have different ethnic identities, but share the same racial identity. You may have people who have the same ethnic identity, but then different racial identity, because these things are ethnic identities are influenced by typically racial identity, but also by geography. It's important though to note that it's rare now to see people refer to race by itself, because there's kind of this growing acknowledgement that we all belong to the same race, the human race, and these differences among people are more about these kind of culturally constructed differences and not about these biologically determined differences. It's less about biologically determined differences. We're biologically much more similar to each other across groups than we are different. In general, it's important to, as we talked about at the very beginning, remembering those key guidelines, be specific and be sensitive. And so when you're talking about a group that includes maybe Cuban Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Mexican Americans, you wouldn't just necessarily refer to them as the Latino participants. If there are meaningful differences in there and they need to be addressed, you talk about each group. If for your particular study there's not a meaningful difference, then they are the Latino participants. So the appropriate levels of specificity, and then you need to be sensitive. And we talked before about how to be sensitive. One way to be, ask. You ask participants what terms they prefer. Ask members of a group what terms they prefer. Because again, we talked, the terms do change over time, and there are differences within groups about what people are comfortable with. And the other thing you can do, especially the kind of conflicting results from asking people, is read other authors, read kind of recent work that's been published in the field, and see what terms people are using, and you'll probably be okay. Okay, some important things to keep in mind is to maintain parallel designations. So if you are describing one group at a certain level of specificity, you don't describe the other group at a different level. So we wouldn't say, some Cuban Americans and some Latino individuals, right? Because we have one group identified kind of by a geographic region, and the other by a shared ethnic identity related to a shared language. So it'd be more appropriate here, if this is what we're talking about, to talk about Cuban Americans and Mexican Americans. And then another thing, which is just kind of a minor style thing, you don't hyphenate modifiers. And we'll talk about hyphenating later. So generally when you have two words together to modify another word, they get hyphenated, but not for, we're talking about racial and ethnic identity. So about African American doctors, there's no hyphen between African and American, even though for most other things in APA style, two words that modify another noun, they work together as one modifier. You would hyphenate, not for racial or ethnic identity. Okay, so coming to the end here, writing about disabilities or age, and talk about these two things together, not because there's a kind of a significant overlap in content, but just because space in the slides. So just kind of want to point that out, that I'm not saying that age and disabilities are necessarily related in any kind of meaningful way. They just both fit on this one slide. Okay, so individuals with disabilities. As we talked about before, it's important to use person-first language. So, person person with spinal cord injury, right? Not paraplegics or not paralyzed individuals. We avoid euphemisms, so trying to kind of get around saying what you're saying, so using something that's maybe not a typical word, like working with the handy capable, not really appropriate for the APA style. And especially with this group, we don't call them patients or clients unless we're writing about them in some sort of hospital or clinic setting. Just because somebody has a disability, medical, cognitive, or otherwise, they're not necessarily a patient. Right? It's not, because a patient is part of identity when you're in a certain setting. If you're not in that setting, then that's not an appropriate part of identity at that time. Okay. When talking about age, as we talked before, provide specific ranges whenever possible to kind of clarify what you're talking about. Boys and girls. And that could be a lot of different things. And a 2-year-old boy or girl is very different than a 8-year-old girl or boy. Right? So be specific when talking about ages. When talking about older adults, don't use terms the elderly or seniors, no longer really acceptable, not to be pejorative. So instead use the term older adults. And if you read the kind of gerontology literature, you'll see they break it down even further in terms of the young old, the old, and the old. But even when they do that, they should be providing some guidelines in terms of age ranges that apply to those different descriptors. So, summing up, describe at the appropriate level of specificity. Right? So again, not overly broad where you kind of are glossing over important differences, but not so focused that you're pointing out irrelevant differences among individuals or between individuals. And then the other big thing is be sensitive to the labels. Try to be culturally aware that the words you use have power and have meaning. And it's not just about being politically correct, not to step on somebody's toes, but it's an understanding that using certain words carries our ideas and our research in a certain direction, and using other words carries in a different direction. And some directions are more helpful than others. Along those lines, people are more than the sum of their labels. Right? All these labels are just ways of trying to describe pieces of identity. But as we're trying to do that, it never gives us a full picture of the person, and it needs to be kind of important. It is important that you recognize that kind of fundamental truth that you can't capture the full identity of a person no matter how many labels you pile on, because people are more than just members of these groups. They're people first. Again, we talked about ask participants, ask people what terms they're more comfortable with, and then the other piece of advice that I'll just reiterate is to read recently published work and see what terms are being used, because they do change over time, and you don't want to be using outmoded terms. Okay, so be sensitive, be specific, and as much as you can, try to figure out for yourself why this is important. Because if you don't get that, if you don't get why using culturally sensitive, non-biased language is important, then you're going to fall repeatedly into the trap of using it. All right, good luck.